The Lost Calm mod is what you'd get if you combined the Lizardmen with Jurassic Park. That's not me just saying that. The full title is literally Lost Calm Jurassic Normal. Update for patch 5.0. It introduces a massive number of new dinosaur units to the Lizardmen roster, as well as a campaign mechanic to unlock them, finally giving the lizards what they needed all along. Campaign mechanics that actually are fun. So how does all of this work and is it any good? Let's have a look and find out right after I tell you about Instant Gaming. If you like buying or playing games, God knows the two aren't exclusive, then you need to check out Instant Gaming. They have keys for almost any game you can think of, for almost any platform you can think of, and basically everything is way cheaper than you can find it anywhere else. Maybe you want to finally pick up Elden Ring when the DLC drops. They have you covered with 23% off. Or maybe you're looking to finally cross BioShock off your backlog and finally find out what the deal with this Andrew Ryan guy is all about. How's about a side of 57% off with that? The bottom line is games for low prices, all backed up by 700,000 reviews on Trustpilot and 24/7 customer service if you do have any kind of issue. Plus, anyone who buys anything using my link is entered into a giveaway for any game key you want, so why not give it a try? Check them out using the link in the description and grab yourself some cheap games, all while supporting the channel. Thanks to Instant Gaming for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get into the mod. Let's start with how it works. The main way to get these new units is through expeditions. This steals the caravans mechanic from Cathay and the Chaos Dwarves, but instead of sending them out to bring back gold, you're instead sending them out to bring back units. And don't worry about them being taken out while they're wandering through the map. Unlike caravans, these armies move hidden throughout the map, so can't be instantly killed from any anti-player bias. There are several locations you can send these throughout the map, and each one has their own roster of possible units you can gain depending on how many resources you allocate to the convoy, and any dilemmas it comes across on its journey. Each expedition will ask you to choose a goal and you have 4 options. Field Research will grant you a temporary faction-wide growth and research bonus, Egg Collector will grant you a selection of low-tier dinos with a couple of mid-tiers, Herd Extraction will grant you a mix of mid-tier dinos, and Live Capture will grant you a few high-tier dinos. Field Research and Egg Collector are available from the start, but the other two will need to be unlocked via the Expedition Chief skills at levels 9 and 15. As far as I can tell, you can only ever have one expedition at once, but once you have a few levels in your lords, you can invest more gold in them and end up with plenty of dinos to go around anyway, so it's hardly holding you back. Similar to other caravans, you can't recruit units into these armies directly, but over their travels they can pick up units via certain dilemmas, letting them get access to a variety of units. You can also choose to upgrade certain dinosaurs to higher tiers, and this steals a mechanic from the Warriors of Chaos. Once a unit reaches a high enough level, they'll be able to upgrade to the next tier up. This isn't available for every unit, and each one of the upgrades is going from a wild dino to one with riders, so it's not like an evolving Pokemon or anything. I'll cover each of these units in more detail once we get to the units part, but just know that farming XP and upgrading to the higher tiers is well worth the golden effort, since it's improvements across the board every time. Now, let's get into the units. This mod adds 39 new units to the Lizardmen roster, so in the interest of keeping this video not being 2 hours long, you'll forgive me for keeping the descriptions brief. First of all, let's start with the new lord, the Expedition Chiefs. These are similar to Oxyotl, but a little worse across the board, including a lot less armor-piercing range damage. They can still perform the same job of flanking around enemy lines and firing into their key targets for some decent damage. Maybe just focus their shots onto less armored key targets to make sure they push through, and you should be fine. I don't want to spend too much time talking about these guys since I know they're not the main draw of the mod, so let's cover their skill tree and get to the good stuff. They have a standard Red Lion and Predatory Fighter to improve their army and themselves in combat. Unseen Predator is unique to them and comes with several buffs to themselves and the army that I believe are entirely made for this mod. Pathweaver increases the chances of a double move, which I believe means skipping a turn in their expedition. Animal Wrangler and Hunter of Hunters simply unlocks these higher tier expeditions, so should be rushed as soon as you unlock them. Along the bottom, we have skills to aid them on their outings. You can increase the chance of an inset battle being an ambush, increase armor replenishment, as well as the number of specimens gathered per expedition, as well as how much money you can invest into their mission to increase the rewards. Lastly, Passionate increases theirs and their army's XP gain, which is great to level them up fast and upgrading any dinos to pick up. Now for the real units. You're going to have to forgive my pronunciation for some of these, because looking at my list now, it's just a mash of consonants, so I'm going to do my best. First up, we have the Pariahs. These are very similar to Harpies, but are a little bit better across the board. They're a super fast blitz attacker with decent damage, and a great focusing down backlines units. We have the Arceopteryx. These are a much improved Warhounds unit with a smaller unit size, but improvements across the board. They deal way more damage and have a bonus versus infantry, so are excellent at taking out backlines ranged troops in seconds. They're still super fast to make for great flankers, they just don't have the stats to stand up to real units. Vulcans are basically a direct upgrade with better stats for everything but damage. That said, it's double entity count, so they still end up on top. You can use these pretty much the same to take out backlines infantry, just be careful of real units as their stats keep them from being too deadly. The Carconyx is pretty much a more feathered manticore. They are fast, flying monsters that can deal great damage to most infantry. Focus on backlines as a hitbox can make it challenging to take on proper melee troops with real damage. If you are going front lines, then just give it a bit of help to stay alive. We have Parasaurs. These are a non-armor piercing cav alternative. They still have some pretty great speed, so can flank very easily. They just don't have a lot of charge or melee stats, so backlines infantry will likely be the best bet, especially with the low armor piercing damage. They can work on the front lines, just give them lots of support to stay alive. Ceropods are fairly similar to the Parasaurs, but with some slight adjustments overall, making them a lot sturdier in combat at the cost of less speed and damage. The melee stats see the most change with tons more attack as well as a boosted defense. Stick them in the front lines, focusing on low armor targets, and they should do decently well and provide some nice meatiness. Nuattles are again quite similar to the Parasaurs, but drop some speed to gain armor piercing melee as well as some range damage. They deal decent non-armor piercing magical slowing damage with a bonus versus large from a medium range, making them great for showering onto frontlines monsters or cav stuck in combat. If you can't get them stood in water, they replenish ammo and get a lot more range, so this is well worth doing whenever possible. They're an overall great support unit both in melee and from a range, but are still a little vulnerable if they get pinned down. Cherupins are similar to these Ceropods, but are even more defensively focused with much lower stats for everything but health, leadership, and armor. They can even toggle to withdraw into their shells, making them even tankier at the cost of not being able to move or attack. I'm not sure why you'd want a literal meatball of a unit, but if you do, then these are just the ticket. Next up, we have the Ictolamimus. This is a mid-tier kind of Troglodon unit with stats that reflect this. It's not quite as good across the board, but has a staggering amount of ammo and great range, so can fire from quite a distance for great armor-piercing damage in somewhat of a scattershot barrage. In melee, it's mostly the same with high damage but not the best melee stats, so ranged is the best way to play to keep them safe whilst getting the most value. The Kriktonov is basically a slightly better Feral Stegodon. It's a little bit more armor and defense and damage, but aside from that, it's the same stats-wise. Performs all the same jobs of getting into the front lines and dealing plenty of damage whilst tanking just as much. As long as it's not totally surrounded, you should have a good time. Dilophoiraptors are another hybrid weapons unit, and comparing this to Nuattles, they have a much better melee performance and are much worse ranged. The range damage is low ammo, low range, and low damage, and this is more something you use right before they head into melee to give them an edge, especially with that blinded stats effect. In melee, they're not bad with okay stats and high non-armor piercing damage. With the blind, they should do okay performing blitz attacks onto the backs of the front lines, but otherwise, keep them on enemy ranged infantry for easy kills. We have the Gyrodon. This is a little worse than the Kriktonov, with less armor and damage, but does the same sort of job. Get on the front lines tanking and dealing plenty of damage, and you should have a great time. The Omicanths have worse stats aside from damage than the Dilophoiraptors, but come with Wall Breaker, so are very useful in a siege to make lots of entrances into cities, which will not be a bad thing if you're using a bunch of these dinos. Outside of that, they're decent charging monsters with high armor, just don't let them get pinned down, or that low defense will come to bite them, even if their own damage is pretty good. Yamiboro drops a little bit of armor to gain much more damage than the Omicanth, much improved melee stats, especially attack, and almost double the damage with lots of armor piercing. Use them to charge into the front lines, either from the flanks for extra impact, or head on alongside your infantry for more security. Just keep them fighting and don't let them get surrounded for easy dubs. The Jehelox drops even more armor to gain much more charge bonus. These are pure charging dinos with decent melee stats and chunky armor piercing damage. Keep them moving in and out of enemies at all times to maximize their damage and keep them healthy. They're not overly squishy, but still, best keep them as safe as possible so they can keep charging all battle long. The Behillus drops some tankiness and charge bonus from the Kriktonov to gain more speed and melee stats. Damage is about the same, but now has a bonus versus large, making it a great monster or cav killer. Get on the front lines, focusing on any large targets to get the most out of its damage, otherwise just keep it fighting alongside allied troops to avoid it being surrounded. The Raycophorus drops even more tankiness to gain more speed and attack as well as bonus versus infantry. With such high damage it'll do great on the front lines, but with that low defense it can be quite the risk. You can use the high speed to get into the back lines, but that much armor piercing is a little bit overkill unless you're going against the dwarves or something. It is a bit of a strange unit, but no less useful against the right army. Manticuda riders are souped up Nuattles with improvements more or less across the board. Range damage is nice and armor piercing, so can do well against tougher foes. The range is medium, but with flight and speed like that, they should have no trouble getting an angle if they need one. In melee, they're not bad with high attack and damage, but lower armor and defense makes them pretty vulnerable if they get focused. Use up that range damage first, and then bring them into melee to finish up what's left. The Macopleurodon is a less tanky, more damaged focused version of the Yamiboro. It pretty much works the exact same, it just hits harder and gets hit harder. Extremely high anti-large armor piercing damage makes it great versus monsters or cav. Low defense and armor make it a little bit risky if it gets surrounded. Keep it by allied units, focusing key targets, and pray it doesn't get itself stuck in too deep. Zolodocus is more or less the same unit, but with improved melee, health, and leadership, as well as swapping to anti-infantry. Use it the same now, focusing on key infantry-based targets and worry a tiny bit less about being surrounded. Still worry, but not quite as much. And the last of the ancient wildlife is the Ornisornis. This is back to anti-large and drops some damage to gain more defense, as well as flight and the speed that comes with it. This makes it a great monster killer since you can send it off to chase whatever large target you want, and chances are they won't be able to outrun it. With damage and melee stats like this, it'll also do well in whatever combat it finds itself in. Just keep an eye out for it being surrounded or focused with range, as that hitbox can make it an easy target if it flies too deep. Next we have the ancient war beasts. First up we have the Kulchan Riders. These do exactly what they say in the tin. They're Kulchans with riders bringing improved stats and a bonus versus large. They can be used pretty much the same, but are now better at that job, and are also halfway decent early cav killers. The Ceropod Riders gain some dazed imbued missiles that they can fire whilst moving. Aside from that, the exact same unit, so can be used the same, only now have some extra range damage being tossed out there, debuffing anything they hit, and this can be used whilst they're in melee. Next to the Trooping Gunner team, similar to the last unit, they're the same, but now come with missile troops on their backs. This missile damage is a lot more significant as it's armor-piercing shield breaker and has a massive range, making them into tanky sniper nests that can focus down key targets from miles away. They can even hop into their shells to gain some range and tankiness. This makes a lot more sense than their base units and work excellently as flanking snipers that are very hard to kill. Parasol Rider teams are again almost the same as the base unit, but gain some short range poison missiles and a ton of ammo. Use them to get into enemy flanks and stick them on skirmish to spread that poison as much as possible to debuff enemies constantly. Keep them out of melee as much as you can, which should be easy given their speed and quick step ability. The Durodon with the C-beam engine is the same unit, but now has a big ass cannon on its back. It's basically a mobile artillery with massive range, crazy damage, and plenty of ammo. Get an angle on key targets and let it rip with that stupid armor-piercing damage. Versus infantry or large targets, it'll rip either way with that crazy burst fire. It's also great versus walls and gates, so in a pinch, can break you into cities no problem. We have the Krichtonov Nova engine. Similar to the last unit, it's the same but has an artillery piece on its back. This time it's even more range, but some more reasonable flaming magic damage. These attacks blind anything they hit, so try to focus on major threats on enemy front lines to keep them weak and support your front lines. The damage on paper doesn't seem that crazy, but in practice, it is insane versus clumps. The Jehelot Riders, similar to the Kulkan Riders, have the same unit, but better stats for armor, leadership, and charge bonus. Use them pretty much the same, just now they have an easier time keeping them alive and enjoy dealing a little bit more damage to larger targets. And lastly, the Yami Boro Riders. These are the same as before, but better across the board. Use them basically the same, but now they're tankier and deal more damage. What's not to love? We also have the Ancient Allies. First up, the Gokolo Carnivores. These are an extremely fast, ground-based monstrous infantry that look like dinosaur xenomorphs. Compared to Kroxgors, they're less tough and deal less damage, but are leagues faster and have some decent charge bonus, as well as stalk. This makes them great flankers that can strike from basically anywhere, taking on backlines and front lines with ease. As long as they don't get totally pinned down, they should do great. Gokolo Spitters drop basically all stats to gain some armor-piercing missiles. They can fire on the move to make some excellent flanking units, and they're going to have to be with such short range. Use their armor-piercing to focus down key targets until they use all their ammo, then use that same speed to get into enemy back lines, and leave the front for the rest of your troops if you have the option. Gokolo Hunters are slower but stronger than basic carnivores with some more defense and damage. They can be used more or less the same, but are a lot tankier at the cost of being slightly slower getting around. You can still pull off flanks pretty easily, you just might struggle to chase down or outrun cav. Gokolo Chargers drop melee attack and entities to gain a lot more armor, defense, and a little bit of charge bonus. The real benefit is the Ogre charge ability, as it allows them to plow through braced units and ignore most charge defense every time they charge. That was poor English. Use them to cycle charge enemies anywhere on the map and you'll have a great time. And finally, the Gokolo Prime. This is pretty much a giant single one of these things. Stat improvements across the board over hunters with tons of damage, great melee stats, decent charge, and the killing blow, giving it a boost to any damage as if it needs it. With the bonus versus large, it can focus on other giant monsters to make the most of that, but honestly, with damage and stats this high, just get it fighting and it'll rack up damage and kills in no time. And lastly, we have the legendary animals. The Colossodon Rex is like a Carnosaur on several types of steroids. Massively buffed stats, including double the damage and blazing speed. Devastating to anything in melee, but that bonus versus large makes it particularly deadly versus other giant targets. The Tyrant's Roar ability reduces the defense of all nearby enemies, making it even more devastating. The only downside is that giant hitbox, so be wary of ranged, but aside from that, just tear everything to pieces. The Quetzalcoatlus is not quite as crazy stats-wise as the Rex, but still a pretty OP unit. A flying dragon lizard with crazy high melee stats, great speed, and excellent armor-piercing damage. It can get anywhere on the map in moments, so literally attack whatever you want and it'll get there. Front lines, back lines, cav, anything is a fair target as long as it's doing something and doesn't totally get pinned down. You can also use an explosive ability for even more damage, as well as granting speed and missile resist to nearby allies. And our final unit is the Thunder Lizard. If you thought the Rex was big, holy moly is this one big boy. It's essentially a souped up Zolodocus with crank stats for pretty much everything. The melee stats are pretty mid, but it does have some limited ranged ammo, but frankly, absurd damage. For sure, turn off fire at will and make the most of those few artillery class shots to take down key targets and guarantee yourself the win. Once it's out of ammo, get it in the front lines, avoiding missile fire and being surrounded, and it should do well versus as much infantry as you can throw at it. So now I wrap up with my thoughts about the mod. From a fun perspective, it's honestly a home run. I wasn't joking when I said the lizards have basically no mechanics, so this mod giving them something to do outside of Endless Conquest is an automatic dub. Yeah, the expeditions are kinda basic and only ever having one makes it feel quite tedious, but they get the job done in getting you to the real meat of the mod, the units. They're a blast, and are for sure way overpowered. Even some of the cheaper dinos are just phenomenal, but those endgame options are bananas. If you really care about balance, then you probably want to avoid this since it's 100% way too strong. But if you're here for fun, spectacle, and unit variety, you're in for a treat. Granted, I only played around with the mod in campaign for a couple of hours, but as far as I could tell, it didn't have much impact on my game and I never crashed. The installation is also a single click, which makes things so much easier than having to move any files around. Overall, I'm pretty pleased with this mod, and while I wouldn't run it in every game, I'd switch it on every time I'm playing the lizards just to give them something to do and rule the world with dinosaurs. And that's just about everything I have on this Lost Calm mod for Warhammer 3. Let me know what you thought of the mod in the comments below, as well as let me know any other mods you'd like me to check out. Like, subscribe, and if you want more Warhammer 3 mod videos, then check out this video on the Necromancy mod.